there's still a lot of resistance, and politics mirror society. There's still laws even and policies in various countries that still outlaw this space. This is an opportune time for the African region to dialogue on these issues, find ways and strategies to respond or take forward Resolution 275. Governments tend to respond well to issues that come from the ground, to perspectives that come from the ground. So prepare the groundwork, but work your way up. As national human rights institutions, we must ensure the protection of the rights of every human being, regardless of their differences. That as civil society, we must strive to effect positive change in our societies. That as government, we must respect, promote, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all our people. We are all human, and we need to be treated as such. It is a message that we must spread all over Africa. We must build communities and a society in which persons are accepted and respected, irrespective of one's sexual orientation, gender identity, expression by all, including states all over Africa.
Considering that freedom, equality, justice, and dignity are essential objectives for the achievement of the legitimate aspiration of the African people. Every individual shall be equal before the law. Every individual shall be entitled to equal protection of the law. So if we have a charter saying that every person shall have all these rights, how then are people excluded from the protection of the charter on the basis of their sexual orientation? That's the question that we have asked. What is the legal basis for excluding people from the protection of the charter on the basis of LGBTI? At last count, I counted about 75 countries on the continent that criminalizes sexual acts between adults of the same sex. We know about laws in Nigeria, in Gambia, in Uganda, and in many other countries, including the Nigerian same-sex marriage prohibition bill. Now, having said that, what arguments are really used by people who want to deny LGBTI persons protection under the Charter? But I would like, in the short time frame that I have, to just go back to the very Charter that they are talking about and just pick on some of the very profound articles which debunk that notion. Every individual shall have the duty to respect and consider his fellow beings without discrimination, and to maintain relations aimed at promoting, safeguarding, and reinforcing mutual respect and tolerance. That is our charter. So my final words is to say that I request the South African government, I put them really on the spot as one of the state parties to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, to engage constructively, to take leadership and engage constructively with other states parties on the implementation of Resolution 275, but also on the rights of LGBTI persons. Because when we are in Addis, when this matter comes up for discussion, we sometimes feel that we are on our own as the Commission with no one to protect us. I thank you.
For the first time, the African Commission mentioned the words they have avoided all along. When the African Commission was formed since 1981, there's never, no document at all has recognized the word sexual orientation and gender identity. When they rejected Carl's observer status, It was from the standpoint that in Africa we don't have a common stand on who is gay or lesbian and nobody really wanted to mention those words. But now a resolution from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, I couldn't believe it. I said eventually they came to a resolution. Bravo. And for me, the mere mention of those words that majority of commissioners would just bury their heads in the sand, and eventually it happened in a resolution. It's a good starting point for me.
I've always personally believed in attending seminars, workshops, because there is something new you learn. And I think, as they say, knowledge is power. The subject we are talking about is controversial. And times we make statements without fully understanding it. So coming here, to me, was adding on to what I already knew, because I also happen to head the Human Rights Commission in my country. So these are matters I deal with. But now I see it from an African perspective, hearing different regions, hearing different people, and sharing our experiences with them. We must endeavor to understand the subject. Unless we human rights defenders understand it fully and grasp it, we will not be in a position to defend it ably. We must engage the politicians. We must engage the parliamentarians, because these are the people who make the obnoxious laws.
We find that it becomes very topical during elections. This whole issue of same-sex sexuality, how it is an African, and political parties use it to whip up a lot of sentiment to get voted into power. And the question I ask my colleagues, how much are we investing in changing the narrative? Because when we show politicians that this doesn't sell, things will change. We are the ones who vote them into power. How involved are we in political processes? In many of our countries, we consider the politics too dirty to be involved in it. So we do social justice activism. It doesn't translate in the ballots. So I think there's without mincing words around the duty of the state to enforce, to protect, to respect the rights of everyone, irrespective of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. I would also challenge myself and my colleagues to be more involved in the political processes in our countries, because until our voices begin to make a difference at the ballots, we probably will not get the politicians to change their language.
You know, one of the things that happens to us as activists is we start becoming cynical and jaded and deeply mistrustful of these kinds of processes and so on. And I think as South Africans in particular, we can add to that a kind of disenchantment with the kinds of legal reforms and so on, and we feel, you know, what have these things done for us and so on. And this is not to, so what I'm about to say is not to undo all of that, but to rather say that I think we need to acknowledge this as a significant moment, a moment that has political potential, a moment that is important for activists across the continent to get together, first as activists, and then also in our various spaces and roles and so on. So I feel strangely optimistic. I never thought I would, but I do. I think that when I look out across the fairly full conference space, and I see that there are people from not every country on the continent, but from so many more countries than there were 15 years ago, 20 years ago when we started doing this work. Of course, the conversation has changed. It's had to. It's had to change. And I think that we are now presented with a situation across the continent, across the globe, where broader sexual rights have been collapsed into very narrow identity politics. That's our new struggle as we move forward. How are we going to create a world that actually is where it doesn't matter, we don't need to claim our sexual orientation in order to gain rights, but that everyone's right to make decisions over their bodies, over their desire, over who they form relationships with is really up to that individual.
I'm a lesbian, and I am because we are. One of the things I want to say is that as the activists in the room, the people who are called however we are named, lesbians, gay, bisexual, all of these labels that we attach to groups for various reasons, often unnecessary. We do not come into this space as victims. We have been victimized, we have been excluded, we have been marginalized, we have been oppressed, we have been violated and discriminated against, but we come here as agents, we come here as people with power. We come here today as Africans. I said as part of my bio that the Coalition of African Lesbians, before we are lesbians, before we are all of these things, we recognize Pan-Africanism. And as Pan-Africanists, one of the basic and most fundamental principles is that we think for ourselves. And that's one of the things that we want to encourage in the next 3 days, that we do not assume ideas that have been passed on to us by people that we don't know, that we don't necessarily agree with their politics or their ideas of power and oppression and freedom and autonomy and justice. But when they say, this woman standing up there, Dawn Kavanagh, is un-African, unholy, immoral, insane, and inhuman, that we can begin to take those one by one and ask, whose idea is this? I'm a survivor of sexual violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and I will not be a victim. I will not allow anyone to make me a victim. I stand here with a sense of power, and I will challenge that particular violence. But what was the purpose of that violence?
People laugh at me, say, you no advise your daughter for make you no be lesbian, then you allow him? I say yes, because na him choice, na him like him. So I no get for stop him. Say we then kill him. People laugh at me. Oh, we been dey advise you. Now your daughter, they don't kill him. Wait till you benefit out of this. I say, all things dey to God. Me no know who that do am, but God know. Because they like it today. I know for the suffer. They kill me picking and stab and brutal. Stab and yeah. Chest. But I go die. I recall that when we started operations in the commission, that was 2 or 3 years after that incident occurred. We went to the police and engaged the police on that particular murder issue. And what they told us was that they did not have evidence. But at that time, we did not have the opportunity of meeting with Fanny Ann's mom. We've met with her today, and we've told her that when we go back, our commission would have a dialogue with her so that we know exactly what really happened. It make the office now carry this lesbian business in Sierra Leone. You go on radio, it talk. You go on television, it talk. They say, this bikini get mind. Some man talk for killer, they can't see there, not for allow him. But me pikin no shame. Yes. He say, mommy, it like when people and they make comments, say, if I die safe, I die for my job. So I not going for hesitate for do anything. Na me like him. I say yes. And indeed, my daughter, he died and kill him. It's a very unfortunate incident, and I don't think any government would be happy to say that, you're allowing this thing to go unpunished. you're not protecting your people. I think it is government's responsibility to protect everybody from violent attacks, from discrimination, and to ensure that people are equal before the law, because human rights is about equality before the law, it's about human dignity, it's about universality, you know. So I think we're making progress in that regard.
Me dey appeal now for make una stop this killing, for make them they kill we pikin there, innocent one.
When we say we are coming together to find practical solutions and we want to end violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, it means we have to ask, what is the purpose of violence?
We have made strong pronouncements as a commission against violence and discrimination against persons of different sexual orientation. We have also called on the police to make sure that when they do get reports from persons relating to these issues, that they investigate and prosecute and ensure that they are not discriminated against.
Sierra Leone is one of the few countries who accepted almost all the recommendations of the UPR recommendation in 2011, except those recommendations dealing with repeal of laws that criminalize sexual activity and addressing violation based on sexual orientation. And we use this platform to remind the states that in as much as they have rejected the recommendation on this issue, that they have an obligation and responsibility, and we also use the opportunity to condemn violation and discrimination and violence against LGBTI persons. We have also engaged with law enforcement officials on reports of failure to investigate complaints against alleged perpetrators of violence on the grounds of imputed or actual sexual orientation. We also have a culture of silence by survivors of violence and discrimination. Some survivors refuse to cooperate with the commission or even law enforcement officials, probably due to fear of stigmatization.
This conference comes at a point when a lot of activists are now taking the lead in the continent, the Pan-African movement, and sort of telling the West this cliche that in Africa it's very hard to be gay, it's very hard to be a lesbian. I don't know. Now we are in Africa, and this is our continent. We are not going anywhere, and we are here to speak for ourselves. It's upon us to take those conversations to our communities. I believe the West has done its part. It is our turn to take the leadership.
How does the law and courts become a source of refuge when the same law serves the purpose of legitimizing some of the violations that we're talking about? The position that the law plays as a defender or as a protector remains questionable. On the continent, we know that very few lawyers actually who are willing to take on these cases. Courts can ratify, but they do not necessarily lead social change. And that requires the state to take extra measures, not only to protect people from violence, but also to protect people from discrimination